Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to support my colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's motion on the management of abandoned vessels. Indeed, in Quebec, in the Montérégie region, we have a case of an abandoned vessel, the Catherine Spirit cargo ship. The boat's been tied up since 2011 on the banks of Lake Saint-Louis, and it's the section of the Saint Laurent between Vaudreuil, Dorion, Montreal, and Châteauguay. I have received over 130 emails from my constituents who are concerned about the environmental risks that the Catherine Spirit represents. And I tip my hat to the Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi, who has furthermore raised this issue in the House several times before I arrived here. The process is now been taken to eventually dismantle the Catherine Spirit, and it's been a complex case because the wreck contained a considerable amount of pollutants. Happily, the vessel no longer poses any environmental risk because the majority of the substances were extracted in 2013. Even though the Catherine Spirit has always been carefully monitored by the Coast Guard and it doesn't currently present any threat, neither for the environment nor the population, it did create a lot of concern for residents and has harmed their sense of safety. Mr. Speaker, the tabling of this motion is an excellent initiative because it is intended to ban the abandonment of vessels while encouraging responsible practices by vessel owners. It recognizes the importance of proper management of abandoned naval vessels. It clarifies and broadens the role concerning the Government of Canada's responsibilities in terms of abandoned vessels as well as their owners. It urges the government to tighten up the regulatory framework for vessel owners. And finally, it proposes setting up preventive measures that will allow for a reduction of risks of abandonment of vessels. Mr. Speaker, allow me to provide you with a chronology of events in the Catherine Spirit story to demonstrate how the spirit of this motion may have reduced the complexity of this story and how it would prevent similar situations from occurring in the future, particularly in terms of environmental risks that abandoned vessels can pose. In 2011, the Catherine Spirit was brought to Lac Saint-Louis by the Groupe Saint-Pierre scrap metal dealers. This cargo ship was then tied up on the banks of the Beauharnois with a view to dismantling it. As the vessel contained pollutants, the community was opposed to its demolition and the plan was cancelled. In 2012, Groupe Saint-Pierre sold the Catherine Spirit to a Mexican business, and that business intended to tow it to Mexico. That project, however, was delayed. It was at that point in time that the first concerns were expressed in terms of the future of the vessel. In 2013, the Coast Guard assessed the state of the Catherine Spirit and found that there was no pollution in the water. However, it ordered the owner to extract the pollutants. Then the Coast Guard continued to regularly inspect the vessel in order to determine the risks of pollution. In the fall of 2015, the Mexican business in question declared bankruptcy. It said that it intended to abandon the vessel in Lac Saint-Louis, and that is how the Catherine Spirit became the responsibility of the government. Since then, the Coast Guard has always monitored the vessel to ensure that it was not accessible by the public and that no pollutants were flowing from it. But clearly we had to find a solution. With the coming to power of our government, Transport Canada, under the direction of our minister, was immediately seized of the file. As of January, the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Coast Guard invited the City of Beauharnois and the City of Montreal to an information meeting. And then our government took its responsibilities in hand, setting up a working group made up of representatives of the federal and provincial governments as well as representatives from the municipalities of Beauharnois and Montreal in order to find a permanent and safe solution to the problem. The working group had three options presented in May. it wasn't as simple as that, because each of these options had risks. That was to say, to leave it in place, to dismantle it, or to tow it to another location. Afterwards, particularly faced with the risk of the capsizing of the ship, the working group and the experts were of the opinion that it should be dismantled in place in a dry dock. Our government, therefore, directed a business to build a dam around the wreck. This work, which should wrap up by January, will allow for the dismantlement to happen safely by the spring at the latest. So, Mr. Speaker, after 5 years of waiting, the population of the Lac Saint Louis Basin can finally see some light at the end of the tunnel. I thank the Parliamentary Secretary, my colleague from Acadie Bathurst, the Ministers of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Coast Guard, as well as the Minister of Transport, for their hard work on this file. But the Catherine Spirit is not an isolated case. According to Transport Canada, there would be some 600 abandoned vessels lying on the shores, in navigable waterways, or on wharfs across the country. Mr. Speaker, I would like to support my colleague's motion, because she seeks to clarify the responsibilities of the Canadian government and also the owners of these abandoned vessels. This is very according to their areas of jurisdiction. And she is also talking about our government's leadership in terms of protecting marine areas and coastal areas. Mr. Speaker, the adoption of this motion would not have a direct impact on the case of the Catherine Spirit, because our government has already taken the necessary measures to deal with this problem safely. But as my honourable colleague just said, we can't be dealing with these on a case-by-case manner. And the motion is intended to recognize the necessity to ban the abandonment of vessels through the relevant legislation, to incorporate an educational component to the government strategy, improve identification of the vessel owners by broadening the scope of the Canadian Register of Vessels, and by looking to set out measures under which the vessel owners would be responsible for the cleanup, and that would go very far to deal with preventive measures in the future. Mr. Speaker, if these measures had been in effect before the Catherine Spirit was abandoned, the government could have managed the situation much more rapidly, and the people would not have had to suffer the same fate. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this motion will ensure that the authorities will be able to act more effectively to deal with these kinds of difficulties caused by other abandoned vessels in Canada, while allowing them to prevent any future cases occurring in the future.
And I think we are seeing support on both sides of the House. We would be exposing ourselves to other risks and other cases of abandoned vessels that would not only pose a menace to our communities and to our environment, but to our country as a whole. Thank you very much.
Resuming debate, the Honourable